Awesome. And now let's highlight some of these. So we'll start off with some code reading. So I'll start us off. On line 7, there's an opening tag for an H1 element with some text content, and then a closing tag for the H1 element. On line 8, there's an opening tag for a form element. Noah, could you do line 9, do 9 through 12?
Opening div tag on line 9, line 10. An opening label tag with an attribute with attribute 4 equals some string and with a text email, and closing label tag line 11 with a closing div tag.
Opening div tag.
There's an opening, another nested opening div tag, and inside an inline tag input, an opening input tag with an attribute name with some string, and another type attribute with a string, and ID equals string.
ID attribute. Yep.
ID attribute.
Perfect. Yep. Thank you. Line 13, closing tag for the div element. Line 14, another closing tag for the div element. Line 15, an opening tag for the div element. Caroline, could you do 16 through 18?
Yes. On line 16, there's a opening label tag element with a 4 attribute followed by some string, and then there's some text content followed by a closing element label element tag. On line 17, there's a opening div element tag. On line 18, there's an opening select element tag with a name attribute and an ID attribute.
Perfect. Thank you. Rukaya, could you do 19 through 21?
On line 19, we have the opening option. We have the opening tag for the option element with the attribute value, followed by some text content, followed by a closing tag for the option element. On line 20, we have the opening tag for the option element with the attribute value, followed by some text, followed by an entity, followed by a closing option tag. On line 22, we have the opening option tag with the value, with the attribute value, followed by some text and an entity and the closing option tag.
Perfect. Thank you, Rukaya. Line 22, opening option tag with a value attribute being assigned a string, some text content, which includes an HTML entity, and then a closing tag for the option element. Line 23, closing tag for the select element. Lines 24 and 25 have closing tags for the div element. Line 26 has an opening tag for a div element. Noah, could you please do we'll do 27 through 31.
An open paragraph tag with some text, and closing the paragraph tag. Line 28 is an opening label tag with some input, and inline input tag with the 3 attributes, type and name and value equals some value. On line 30 is a blank.
Some text.
Some text. Okay, some text. And line 31, closing label tag.
Perfect. Thank you.
Because you put it in the supposed to be like inside the HTML, and was like separate, so I got confused.
Caroline, could you do 32 through 35?
On line 32, there's an opening tag for the label element. On line 33, there's the opening tag for the input element with the type attribute, name attribute, and value attribute. On line 34, there's text content, and on line 35, there's a closing tag for the label element.
Perfect. Line 36, there's an opening tag for a label element. Line 37, there's a self-closing input tag with the type attribute, name attribute, and value attributes all being assigned strings. Some text content in line 38, a closing label tag on 39, a closing div tag on line 40. And then Rukaya, could you do 41 through 43, please?
On line 41, we have the opening div tag. On line 42, we have the opening tag for the paragraph element with followed by some text content, followed by the closing tag for the paragraph element. On line 43, we have the opening label tag.
Perfect, thank you. Noah, 44 through 47.
47, an opening input tag with two.
This one is technically a self-closing.
A self-closing tag. Self-closing, an inline self-closing tag with two attributes with some text in line 45. And line 46, closing label tag.
Awesome, thank you. Line 47, there's a closing div tag. Line 48, there's an opening div tag. Caroline, could you do 49 through 51?
Okay, on line 49, there's a label. There's an opening tag for the label element, followed by followed by text content, followed by the closing tag for the label element. On line 50, there's the opening tag for the div element. On line 51, there's an opening tag for the text area element, followed by the name attribute, ID attribute, columns attribute, rows attribute. Oh, I forgot to add this, and closing tag for the text area element.
Perfect, thank you. Line 52, closing tag for the div element. Line 53, closing tag for the div element. Line 54 is a self-closing input tag with the type attribute and the value attribute being assigned strings. Take a look at our quiz questions. Rukaya.
So I saw that for submit, you had used the input element and not the button.
For submit, yes, I'll talk about it in a little bit.
Okay.
But since you already were speaking, can I ask you, what is the purpose of an HTML form element?
So it is to create the form.
Yeah, exactly, essentially, right? It's just whenever I want to collect user data. So if I ever wanted to have like a variety of inputs that a user will fill out, and I need a way of collecting that user input, well, that's where forms allow us to capture that input. Noah, can you give me 5 examples of form control elements?
All right, is it, the control elements, we have input,
Input?
we have, yeah, we have button
Button, we could consider, yeah.
and option,
Option,
label
label,
and select.
select, yep. So those would be 5 different ones. There's a lot more, but yes, that would be 5 examples of some. Input, label, text area is another one. We use select. There's some more, but yeah, those would be 5 examples. Caroline, can you give me 3 examples of type attributes for input elements?
Well, we have a radio attribute, we can have an email attribute, checkbox attribute.
Yeah, so there's a few different options. Yeah, exactly. We have email is one, password is another one, and it'll actually hide and then it'll show those little stars and whatnot for us. So we have password, email, there's radio, there's text. So we have quite a few different options for those type attributes. And then Rukaya, is an HTML input element a block element or an inline?
Inline element.
Inline, they are technically inline block. So they are inline, but they are inline block. So I would be able to technically control the width and the height if I wanted to. But yes, they would be considered an inline element. Awesome. I'll talk about a few things. I'll talk about the that button in the inputs. But before I do, did anybody else have any other initial questions?
I'm gonna ask you.
Okay.
Trey is asking if you could post the solution in Slack so he could go back and look at it after class.
Yes, yes. Let me just do that right now before I forget.
Yeah.
We go. Okay. Awesome. So I'll talk about a few things. So first, I'll answer that one that Rukaya asked. So let me open this up. So down here on line 54, I have an input that is type submit. Well, let's say that I use the button instead. Okay. So now, okay, why is this mad at me? Button submit. There we go. Okay. So on line 54, I have an input. Line 55, I have a button. Well, let's try it. So the left one is my input, the right one is my button. Let's spell out this form. So I'll hit the left side first. The left one is my input. You can see my form submitted. All my data's gone. My form data is gone. Well, let's do this again. And then let's try the right one. So the right one is just my button. Hit submit. See, it also worked. Good form. What's the difference? Nothing. Exact same. So whatever you want to do. You can use input type submit, or you could also use a button. Only caveat with the button is the button also has a type attribute. So by default, since the button is inside of the form, its default type is submit. So it is already acting as a submit button. If I change the type to button, and now when I go to fill it out, you see nothing happens when I click on it.
When this happened, why this happened?
Because I gave type button to my button.
Give a value.
I changed what type of button this was. So by default, since our button is inside of a form, the default type is submit. So since I changed it to button, it no longer is acting as a submit button. So now as soon as I put it here, you can see it's no longer submitting. If I change the type to submit, then you can see that it works just fine. So,
yeah, go ahead.
no. I was just gonna say, so in theory, the exact same thing. There's really no difference between which one you want to use. You can use an input and do type submit, and it'll just look like a button. Or you could also use a button. You just need to make sure that you also change the type to be submit. But if it's already in a form, then you don't necessarily need to do that. It'll already have that default type of submit.
So the submit, I thought it's an arbitrary, so it's no, it's like it's a value built in inside the HTML.
Oh, no, you need to have something to actually submit. So I need something to submit the form. So that's where I have a submit button or some sort of action to actually submit it.
So the value of submit, it's a built in HTML, you has to put it over there.
Only for these elements,
Yeah,
only for inputs and only for button.
and well, if you put a value button, what's gonna, what the
Value just is the text. So where it says submit right here, that's what this value is. You see, it just changes the text. That's all the value's doing, is it's just changing the inputs text. Just like how I put submit right here, it's just the text concept. So if you're using an input for your button, then the value is the text. If you're just using a normal button, then you would put your text in between the opening and the closing text.
visible and yeah. Another thing, why is- Why there's a name attribute, though? What does it do? Because we have an ID, why there's a name? What is
We'll
it?
learn more about this once we come back from break, but we're gonna be learning about the DOM. The name gives me a way of accessing this element in TypeScript or in JavaScript. But there's actually two use cases. Now, I would use this in JavaScript to access it. In the older days of HTML, you would, that's where the action method or the action property came into play. So you would do something like google.com or whatever. And so now let's submit our form. So you can see how it sent me to Google.
Can you say again?
Should have been paying attention. So I added an action attribute to my form to Google. Well, now when I submit to Google, you see it sent me to Google. So the old ways in HTML is the action would be the URL that you would be listening for the user to go to once the form got submitted. And if you look in the URL, you can see all of our form data is right here. You can see it says email equals, and then it has what I typed in right here. So you can see email equals, well, where does that email come from? It comes from the name. So that's where the name comes into play, is we're sending the name attribute to the server. So the server knows what data that input came from. So it knows which field that was associated with.
To the server, and this is why there's a method which is post, right? We are sending something to the server.
Well, you'll learn more about that once you get over to the senior side, but there's, depending on the type of request, am I adding something to a database? Am I just getting something from a database? Am I updating something in a database? Depending on which of those actions would be a different type of request. So if I was creating something, that's a post request.
So there's really important attributes here.
No, these attributes, we do not use these at all anymore.
The name.
Old school way.
Really?
Old school way. Now we do this with JavaScript. This is how you used to do it back in the old days with the action. But now we'll just have our JavaScript running and it'll handle it.
I just wanted to clarify that for JavaScript, then it's important, the input attributes are more important than to utilize in JavaScript, right? So
Which
to have,
attribute,
like,
sorry?
the attribute, the type, and the ID.
Well, the type is necessary because that's how you tell HTML what input to render. So the type is 100% necessary. And then the ID is necessary because we need to link it to the label. And the name is necessary because we need to give each input a name. So they're pretty much always necessary.
They're all very important.
Yeah. So whenever you're creating and working with forms, you'll give every single form control usually a name, sometimes an ID, and then sometimes a type, depending on which kind of form you're working with. Type only exists on inputs. So you can see right here, I'm using a select. A select doesn't have a type. A select is a whole different form control. So I just use a select.
Thank you.
And another question, so we have the label and we have a so we have a label and there's an attribute for username. This is the it's meaning for what is going to be used for
It's how the label is associating with the input. So you can see right here on line 10,
associated.
I put label for equals email address right here on line 10. So now HTML knows that this label is associated with an element that has an ID of email address, which is down here. So this is how this label is now linked to this input. Which leads me to kind of talk about labels. So labels, there's two main functionalities when it comes to labels. One is, so you can see I have this label for equals email address, ID equals email addresses. So now this label and this input are linked. So one of the functionality things that a label does is if I click on the label, you can see it automatically highlighted the input for me. I didn't click on the box, I clicked on the label. Same thing goes for down here. You can see I have my HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. All of these are wrapped in a label. So if I click on the label text, you can see it selected the form control. I'm not clicking on the dot, I'm clicking on the text. So that's one functionality thing that a label does, is it will focus in on the input at which it's associated with. The second and the more important reason of a label is for accessibility. So for people with screen readers. So if someone is blind and they're trying to use our form, well, they need to know what data to put in each input, right? So what the screen reader is going to do is it's going to read the label aloud. So then as soon as they get to this section of the web page, the screen reader is going to say inputs for email. And so that way someone that's using a screen reader knows what they need to put inside of their input right there. So that's why it's very important to make sure that you include your labels, because for accessibility purpose. So that way we're able to have everyone still be able to use the form and submit it in the way of how we're expecting. So those are the two functionality reasons of what a form does and why we always want to make sure that we include them.
And let's see if I can- So. When we looked at the web page, like for example, we have an email and we have this rectangular box for input. So when we create an email, I do like a label when I create form, and then we starting our form, then label, and then put a text in it. It's email. Okay, so. How we create this box, the empty box?
That's the input. It's just this input. So as soon as I get rid of this input, no box. It's just because I have an input. So input, user input, it shows a box to allow the user to type.
So if I remove name attribute, it's not gonna do it. It's not gonna
do anything, but now when it comes to when I go to eventually submit my form. So close out of this.
Because we are not like doing anything.
So look at our URL bar. So you can see it adds all the form data to our URL bar, right? Well, let me submit a form now. So test.test.com. Submit. Do you see test.test.com anywhere up there?
No.
No,
It's not
because I
something-
do not have my name attribute. As soon as I add my name attribute. Email equals test@test.com. And so we want to include name attributes because eventually on the server, we're going to need to grab and capture that data, and we do that via the name attribute. Rukaya?
So for buttons, we're adding like a special value attribute because we're not really typing in an input. Is that why? So that like the name and the value can be paired?
So for the button doesn't get a value at all.
No, sorry, I meant radio. Like
Radio. Oh, yes, these things right here.
no, I think on line 28. Yeah, here, 29.
Oh, yes. So for these with the radio buttons, yes, since there's nothing that the user is specifically typing in, we don't necessarily know what they selected or what was associated with that. So that's why we need to give it a value. So that way we're saying specifically the value of that specific radio button was this.
Okay, and so we don't add the for attribute for the label and the ID for the input then? I mean,
It depends on how you use the label. So you can see right here, I put the input in between the label tags. If you do that, then it's not necessary. Well, I still have the name because we still want to keep track of what input this was, but I don't have the ID in the for because the input is inside the label. If I did it separate, where the label and the input are not inside, so the input is not a child to the label, then I need the for and the ID. So it kind of just depends on which approach you want to do. Do you want to put the inputs inside of your labels? If so, then you don't need the for and you don't need the ID. But if you want to put them separate, then you would do the for and the ID.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
No?
Yeah, so the question, so there's an attribute, it's a field set, so this is only to add like a checkbox, radio.
No, field set is how you group form content. So if you had like specifically a section of a form that was like related, then you would wrap that in a field set, and it's only specifically related to that. So we didn't use it in our example. You could probably make an argument to find specific sections where it makes sense. But if you ever just wanted to group together specific data in a form, that's where the field set would come into play.
So it's like a div? Oh, no.
I wouldn't think about it like a div. I would think about it, I don't really know how to change it. It's literally an element that just only contains those specific form controls.
So we can seem like a group together, like a box and.
Yeah, so if I put a field set here, then let me change it here. So field set. Put it after this one. You see how now
Oh, so
these
that's
two
fine.
inputs, so it's literally only containing whatever those elements are. So if you just had multiple form control elements that were like related, then you could wrap them in a field set, and then now you just have those specific form controls grouped together. I've never once in my life ever used a field set. So
And,
Oh, I was just wondering if we were to use the field set, we could change to not have that box.
yes, yeah,
outline and everything.
that's just all
So
CSS.
it's like all just semantically, if we wanted to kind of structure the code.
Exactly.
We would just enter.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So something like this, right? Like, why is coding cool and favorite language? These questions are a little bit related. They're both coding related. So maybe I only put a field set around those two because they're both kind of related. But again, I've never really ever used a field set. I haven't found like a great purpose of it, but
Mhm.
Great.
any other questions about forms?
And this question here, so why, and so the select, if it's select tag is used for, this for the button and
The drop downs.
the drop down, this is the select, right?
Yeah, the select and the options.
And for. And why, so there's an option when you do select ID country, name country, then option inside it, it's value, it's empty, and then it's like a string, empty
Mhm.
string, please select.
Mhm.
So it has to be, we need to put it empty, right? So we can,
Yes, because I want this option to appear, select an option, but this is like I don't want them to actually submit this. These are the things they actually submit. So this just has an empty value because this isn't like a valid thing to select. I just want like a little placeholder, but in order for me to show a placeholder, it needs to be an option, but I don't want any data associated with it, so I don't have a value. Rukaya?
So sometimes in a form, there's also that option where you're supposed to select, like you somewhat agree, you somewhat disagree, and then like there's that whole bar with like, those options that you have to select. I mean, I don't know how to explain it. So how do you get that? That was basically my question.
Well, there's lots of different ways of how you can build it, so I'm not sure the exact way of how you're somewhat agree form. See if we can find like an image of. Well, something like this, these are all just radios. So now we could do our input type radio, and then we would have a label strongly agree, a label disagree, a label neutral, and then we would have, you know, a value equals strongly agree or value equals agree. So you'd write it out like that. It just kind of depends on how you build it out. If you use radio buttons, then that's how you would do that. You could also do it with the check boxes. So then we would just be, I think there's an input type checkbox, which what we did here with sign up. So it kind of just depends on how you want the form to actually look, and then that would change what element you actually use. Yeah, okay.
I'm actually talking about that scroll bar, you know, where you're just like scrolling across like a horizontal line.
Scroll bar, we scroll across the horizontal
Let me
line.
find a picture. I'll share that with you.
Yeah. Any other questions over guys looking at that? Yeah.
Just question, so is it the comment area on the GIF file? Is it has a tag of text area, right?
Oh, sorry, what?
See, like on the,
Yeah, so 51, this text area right here?
yeah, so the text area, this is for the comment, right? When we see here like a big box, right?
Yes, yeah, so right here, when we have this giant text box with the comments, that's the text area.
And this has to be all these has to be inside the form.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's all associated with that form.
So then if we had multiple forms, we would just have multiple forms wrapped in the form element tab.
Well, they wouldn't be wrapped inside of each other.
No, separate.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
separate.
Mm-hmm.
Would they be named somehow, the forms?
You give them IDs.
IDs, oh,
Yeah, you give form ID, contact form, form ID, submit sign up form or something. Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
No,
you're good.
Sorry.
Mhm.
Is this,
Mhm.
why, so I can see on label, we see like an input tag, there's a radio button. And name is device, so we can interact with the server, but the value here is a iPhone, so we're gonna see on the screen the value iPhone.
It's just what we're sending to the server. So you can see right here where I did y equals fun. So I chose the option that says because it's fun, it had a value of fun. So the value is just what you're sending to the server to say this is what the user selected. Rukaya, were you able to find the image or are you still looking?
Yeah, I found one. It's not the best, but I can share it with you on Slack.
Yeah, send it to me on Slack and I'll pull it up.
So it confuses me like the. Because we see a value, I think, okay, this is what I'm gonna see on screen.
Mm-hmm.
But I can see like with the value, you can see a text, please select. So kind of. This is what confused me. So the value, this is only.
Doesn't always need to be what you like put on the screen. You could put the value to be whatever you want the value to be.
Because it's empty, so if you. So a value for, this is only the value attribute, this is only how to communicate with the server,
It's what we're gonna send to the server.
sent to the server.
Mhm.
But the text, when you see like,
That would be the value.
that's gonna be the value.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Can't say I've ever built a form like this. I assume, I feel like there's gotta be a specific form control element. That would handle this.
I vaguely remember doing this back in school, but now I cannot recall what it was. But I am like, yeah, I think it was in forms and we had made something like this back in school.
Yeah, I think there's some sort of an input that just has a different type that you would be able to use to essentially accomplish this. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I do think, yeah, it in theory, well, let's see, input type MDN. See all the different types that it has. So we have color, we have date, time, image, month, number, range. What is range? Do I not see any range? Let's copy this into ours. Yep. So it looks like input type range, 0, max 25. So I'm not off the top of my head, not necessarily sure how we get the numbers to show. There might be a combination of some CSS and some JavaScript. But yes, I think that would just be a built-in HTML type and that you could just use to get that functionality. Let's see. Show numbers for input range. Those who are still searching, this is little when writing in. So input, on input, set the value equals this value. Oh, and it would show it next, yeah. So you'd have to do a little bit of some JavaScript to actually get the numbers to properly show of what their values are. But the actual slide majibber, is just the range input.
Is it?
Okay, thank you.
Is it on JavaScript to increase it? We're gonna put input +1, so keep going.
No, that was purely just to show the number. So HTML was still handling the update in itself. It's just if I specifically wanted to show the number to the user, for that specific input, I have to use JavaScript.
But the logic like this, right? Like we keep increasing.
That's all built into HTML.
Yeah.
It may be running JavaScript under the hood, but it's extracted away from us. It's already doing it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought we're gonna build the line.
No, we're just capturing the forms. Yeah. Any other final questions about forms? This one's always a doozy.
Yeah, it's first time like encountering.
Yeah, forms are annoying. And they're annoying to style too. With CSS, they just have a lot of built-in stuff. So they're a nuisance to work with for sure. But any other final questions about forms? All right, well then let me make sure I saw everything in chat. Oh yeah, Tracy suggested it was a range slider. Yep, looks like you were right. So let me stop the share, stop the recording.